Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
I'm doing very well. And this is one of those episodes where we really get somebody who's a real mover and shaker in exactly the sort of stuff that we're interested in. So I'm just thrilled. I'm thrilled about today's episode.
Yeah, so today's guest is Andrew Newberg. Andrew is a quite remarkable neuroscientist. He is a professor at the Department of Integrative Medicine and Nutritional Sciences and the Director of Research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. In addition, he has taught religious studies and psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, has been prominent in researching nuclear medical brain imaging, and has published a number of books, including The Principles of Neurotheology, Why Won't God Go Away, and How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the program.
So, one of the things I'm interested in really is neurotheology. And the way that I meet this initially is to ask, for those with no prior context, why is there a relationship at all, and why should there be a relationship at all, between the relatively abstract spirituality and the very materialistic physical brain?
Well, I guess on one hand, there hopefully is an interrelationship between almost everything that we do as human beings and our brain, whether it's music, art, literature, falling in love, doing business, or being religious or spiritual. I think on one hand, we can always look for a relationship, and that is part of what I think the whole field of neurotheology kind of grows out of. But part of what we have looked at, and the we is myself and my colleagues and my late mentor, a fellow by the name of Eugene DeQuilly. Part of what we've talked about is, at least from kind of an evolutionary perspective, if we take that particular perspective for a moment, where is there a connection, or why would there be a connection? And we often talk about this along two basic ways in which our brain works that map very well into what religious and spiritual beliefs and systems actually help us with. These two very basic functions are what we refer to as self-maintenance and self-transcendence. So the self-maintenance part is maintaining ourself and how we survive and getting us through the world. And of course, that can be very complex. That can be solving problems. That can be reading the seasons. That can be how to interact with other people in our lives, people in our community, our families. And all of that is part of what our brain helps with self-maintenance. And actually, the physiological process, too, of staying alive, keeping our heart beating, our hormones, and so forth. The other part of that is what we call self-transcendence, which I guess ultimately is kind of a part of the self-maintenance as well, but is a bit distinct in the sense that it's how we continue to change and evolve ourselves personally over time. And so, we are the same person that we were when we were 5 years old, 15 years old, 30 years old, and so forth. But we also have continued to change and develop and adapt as we go through our lives. And our brain helps us with that. That's, the common term in science today is neuroplasticity. It changes, it can adapt, it can grow, it can learn new things. And when you then kind of say, okay, so that's what our brain is trying to do, how does religion and spirituality work? Well, it turns out that they actually really help with both sides of this discussion. So religious and spiritual beliefs and practices help us to maintain our body, help us to, gives us a sense of morals and a system by which we interact with people. It helps us to make some sense out of the world around us to help us to survive. So it very much helps with the self-maintenance part, and especially when you bring in, as I'm sure we'll talk about, practices like meditation and prayer that help regulate our body and our hormones and our immune system and so forth. And then, of course, the obvious is the self-transcendent part, which is, it's kind of maybe the ultimate expression of self-transcendence, which is the spiritual side of ourselves. How do we get to be something bigger, better than what we are today? How do we connect with something that's more than just ourselves? And so when we kind of look at how well religious and spiritual phenomena map onto what the brain is trying to do, to me, it seems like it makes a lot of sense that the brain would kind of want to hold on to this spiritual side of ourselves as an important way of helping us to live our lives and help us to grow through our lives.
Just the way that you characterize that, it reminds me of Ken Wilber's "Grow Up, Clean Up, and Wake Up." Interestingly, usually when you think about Ken Wilber's sort of tripartite, you think about like embodied practices, worldly practices, and then spiritual practices. But I love thinking instead also as just spiritual practices, as actually facilitating all of those things, as helping you grow up, as helping you clean up, getting a grip on how to just be a good human in the world, and also how to be, more than yourself, self-transcendent as well. It's nice.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it does connect with a lot of approaches, Wilber's, as you mentioned, and various spiritual traditions. The idea of how do we, what are the paths, what are the directions that we can take in order to help us to get to that next way of being for ourselves, to bring us to enlightenment, whatever a particular person's goal may be. And all of this, you mentioned the term neurotheology at the beginning, and a lot of this to me fits into that perspective as well, because we are, not just understanding that religious and spiritual beliefs can help us with these things, but what is the actual mechanism by which this all may work? And I think that in a lot of ways the nexus of the brain is really a wonderful way of helping to find ways of bringing science and the spiritual together, because as I mentioned, it is kind of something is going on with our brain, in our brain, in one way or another when people are spiritual. And the question is, how do we understand that? What can we do with that information? Does it tell us more about our spiritual selves? Does it tell us more about our biological selves? Does it tell us more about consciousness, or all of the above? And I think it's all of the above.
Jamie, I know you've got a question loaded here, but this is just too good. This is like why we made this podcast, was to talk exactly. This is like a dead ringer for what we're interested in. I just want to know all of that. I want to know. So what are you learning about the brain that feeds back into thinking about what it means to be spiritual, or what the benefits of being spiritual are? Is there something surprising or sort of overarching you might want to share?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, to just drive the point home a little bit more in terms of the areas and the topics, and I mean, we could probably have 8 or 10 sessions.
We should do that. We should have 8 or 10 sessions.
That's fine with me. No problem. I'm happy to come back. But part of where those sessions may go is that there's really, to me, this whole field extends from the very practical, which can be studies looking at, if you meditate or if you do mindfulness or yoga or whatever, does it change your heart rate? Does it improve your blood pressure? Does it reduce your risk of stroke? So you get like these very clinical, practical side of things. Then you get, as you kind of move a little bit away from that very practical, you get into, where is consciousness, and how does the consciousness relate to the brain? How does the brain relate to consciousness? So there's that whole piece as well, which helps us to understand this whole relationship between our mind and our brain and all of that kind of question, which has a biological piece, but then also continues to push us a little bit more towards the philosophical and the esoteric. And then you get into all of those kinds of questions: the nature of free will, what is spirituality, what is the nature of the universe? Is it more consciousness? Is it more matter? Is it, some combination? So it really ranges from the very philosophical and theological to the very practical. So that's the full breadth of it. But going to your other way of asking the question about, what do we kind of learn by doing this? I think one of the things that we've learned, and there's been many aspects, but I think one overarching point that I always like to emphasize is that there isn't, at least based on all of the brain scan studies that I've done, that other people have done, there isn't one part of our brain that kind of turns on when we become spiritual. So when you walk into a church or an ashram or whatever, there isn't one part of our brain that says, oh, okay, now it's time to be spiritual. If anything, it seems to be, many different parts of the brain that become involved. And I think for any of the listeners who have engaged in spiritual practices or, had experiences, everyone knows. I mean, they're very multifaceted. They can include emotions, cognitions, experiences, various aspects of the ways in which we think and feel about the world. And so it really shouldn't be a surprise that it's not just one part of the brain, but many parts of the brain. And I would argue it's the whole brain. And of course, as an integrative medicine physician, recognizing the deep relationship between the brain and the body, it's really all of us. And so I think that's, to me, one of the overarching perspectives. We can talk about, well, what do the frontal lobes do, or what does the limbic system do, and that's all relevant as well. But the brain just operates as a very complex network, and to me, it's really all of us that is the religious and spiritual part of ourselves, and but also the biological part. And so again, I think looking at that overall complex relationship becomes very exciting to be able to see how that all fits together.
Yes, speaking of how that all that fits together, some of your initial early work in neurotheology included the use of functional brain imaging for Buddhist meditators and Franciscan nuns in prayer. And there's sort of two natural questions here. The first is, why study the brains of them in particular?
Well, I wish there was a grand answer to that. It is a much more practical answer, which is usually who we have access to.
Yeah, those are the people that are around.
They were the people that were around, exactly. I had a good friend and colleague who was a Tibetan Buddhist meditator and was connected to a community, and so he was able to bring those individuals in. And I don't remember exactly how we got connected to the nuns, but outside of the Philadelphia area where I work, there is a college called Newman College, which had a cloistered set of Franciscan nuns, and they were interested and willing. So, and that, which is another important piece, not just where they are, and who they are, but are they willing? So a lot of it was practical, and a lot of our studies have kind of fallen into that category, especially when it comes to people with a particular proficiency. So, we did a study of people speaking in tongues, and that was, a unique group of individuals who we were able to connect with. I had a colleague who lived in Brazil, and he brought up a group of Brazilian mediums for us to study. So those were the, depending on who and how you can find people, that's a large part of the answer to the question. But part of what I think winds up working out is that, I would love to do the large study of, bringing everybody in from every tradition and doing many different practices. It'd be wonderful to be able to really explore all the different kinds of practices and experiences that people have from all the different traditions. At the moment, we kind of do it a little bit, piecemeal, but I think each one of them does contribute to our greater understanding about what these experiences are and what the practices are and how they affect people. But because of the way it gets done, it's a little harder to compare across them because they are doing fundamentally different things. On one hand, like nuns are women, and you could compare them to Buddhist meditators who are men, but they're doing completely different things. So whether the differences are because they're men and women or they're just doing different things is, there's a lot of interesting questions that come up, but it does become very challenging to know how to interpret all of that.
Right, and that's the second question, which is, accepting that these are broad terms I'm using, meditation, especially the practices that I'm used to, which are breath-focused, and prayer, which I perceive to be almost like, in some cases, being in communication with in some cases, a monotheistic God, in some cases, not at all. They seem to be the types of exercises that on the level of the brain would be different. Are they different in your research, meditation versus prayer?
Well, certainly there can be differences. And so, part of in neurotheology, part of what I get excited about, which is probably a little bit more boring for the average person, but I find it fascinating, is methodology. And that includes trying to understand the techniques and the practices that people are doing. And so part of the answer to your question is that there are certainly some prayer practices that are very much meditation-based practices and are very comparable and very similar. As you mentioned, there are breathwork studies, breathwork practices of meditation, but there are meditation practices where you could be meditating on a visual object, like a candle, for example. And I don't know if a Buddhist meditating on a candle would be that different than a nun meditating on the cross. They're going to probably activate the visual areas of their brain. If they feel that they make some type of deep connection, they kind of become one with the candle, they become one with Jesus or with the cross. Those are probably going to be, there's going to be a lot of similarities in the brain because there's similarities in those practices. But as you also mentioned, and this to me is part of what I think is an exciting area for neurotheology to move into, is to look at all these different kinds of practices. So within prayer, as I mentioned, some prayer practices are fairly contemplative and meditative. Others are very communicative, and there's conversational prayer, just talking to God. There's asking God for certain things. There's petitionary prayer. There's more kind of almost like mantra-based prayer, where if you're just saying the Lord's Prayer or whatever, you're just repeating the prayer over and over again. And so so there can be a whole array of different experiences and practices that arise out of these traditions, which again I think would be really fascinating to continue to explore.
Did you do any cross-cultural analysis to see like where their similarities or differences were between particular kinds of Buddhist meditation and Christian contemplative practices?
Again, I think part of the problem has always been that they're never identical, and so it is. Yeah, so there's always a little bit of that problem to do, and then of course part of the other issue to a certain extent is the beliefs that the people hold. The belief in Buddhism, so to speak, versus the belief in, let's say, Catholicism, are going to be different kind of backgrounds to start with. It'd be really interesting if you could take like a person who is Catholic today doing a Catholic prayer, and then they convert to Buddhism, and then you scan them while they're doing a Buddhist prayer or whatever, Buddhist meditation. But I think it goes back to what I was saying, which is that I think the larger answer to the question, which I still think can be answered to an extent, is that it depends a lot on what the person is actually doing, how they're doing it, and what kinds of experiences they typically expect. So if they feel that they connect with God, then that may not be that different than a Buddhist who feels connected to Buddha. But it could be very different. The feeling of I'm interacting with God in a certain way could be very different than the feeling of kind of absolute oneness or infinite oneness or something like that you might get in a Buddhist kind of concept, and certainly the Enlightenment experience that you might have in Buddhism could be very different than a conversion experience that you might have in Christianity, or maybe not. And I think so the question is a really interesting question in the end, because and I've asked it in a variety of different ways myself. Here's another way of thinking about that question. If people have a very intense spiritual experience, if one person says, I felt God, another person says, I felt a force, somebody else says, I felt love, somebody else says, I felt one, I felt, awe, are they the same experience that then gets described differently depending on the belief systems that they hold and how they think about it? Or are they fundamentally different experiences? And I suspect it's a little bit of both. And hopefully the more we do research, the more we'll learn about how to answer that question.
Yeah, the interesting thing is you have the mechanical distinctions between exercises, like concentration or repetition versus something more conversational. But then you have the ontological beliefs overlaying it, right? So I believe Buddhism, I believe Christianity. To what degree would a Christian and a Buddhist doing identical mechanics be likely to see in a brain scanner different things happening based on the ontological beliefs being different?
Well, I think that the closest I've gotten in terms of doing a study like that, to give you this example, we did a study where we looked at people responding to visual symbols. I know it's going to sound a little strange at the beginning, but you'll see where I go with it. So we showed them different religious symbols, and very briefly, and we looked at their brain scans while they were looking at these different religious symbols, and some were religious symbols, some were non-religious symbols, and then they had different emotional content, positive or negative. And the reason I'm telling you this is that one of the things that we did with these people is we did ask them questions about their belief system and how much they believed in God or not, and what that belief was like. And those questions correlated with the reaction of the brain to these symbols in the primary visual cortex, which is actually kind of in the back of the brain. And I found this to be really interesting because this is before you actually kind of know what the symbol is. This is just how you receive information. And what the big implication of the results were that the way you believe actually changes the way your brain even receives information about the world, even before you start, operating on it. So, I do think that the belief systems that people have, that they start with, as they go into a particular prayer or meditation or whatever, certainly will have an impact, both in terms of the kind of experience they may have and ultimately how they interpret that experience. Now, part of what's also fascinating are that when people get to these very intense experiences and these kind of mystical or awakening or enlightenment experiences, depending on how you want to use that phraseology, that they are really overwhelming and often do change people's beliefs as well. So there is something to be said for the intensity of these experiences, the way in which these experiences can actually change the belief system of a person. So the beliefs can sort of shape the experiences, but the experiences can shape the person. And I think that's really quite fascinating. And we have some kind of biological evidence for it. But again, we haven't been able to answer it in the fullest kind of way to address the way you're asking it. And I think what you're asking is fascinating.
That's one part that's hard to explain to somebody if they don't know what that feels like. But I think it's amazing. And I mean, this is part of the research that I do as well, is the way that top-down beliefs are influencing the way that we're receiving information at all. But I'm reminded of a story. Do you know John McCransky? He's a professor at, I think, Brown, and also a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Lama. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He tells a story where he picked up a Lama to bring to a talk one time out in California, and he took him to this hotel or apartment and then went home. And when he got home, he said he woke up in the middle of the night worried because he realized that actually the apartment was a bit shabby, that they put this very prominent Tibetan Lama who is visiting the United States maybe for the first time, or there's a very rare special occasion. And then he started thinking, oh my goodness, I should have brought him home, or I should have sprung for a better hotel. And so he gets there the next day in an apologetic attitude, ready to say, oh my goodness, he goes in and says, oh, I'm so sorry about this. I hope it was okay. It's a bit dingy. And he says he was struck by the Lama saying, this is a pure land. Don't you know? Don't you know this is pure land? This is perfect. It's perfect. And I think you can take that in a quite shallow way, but there's a quite deep way where you might train the mind to hold a certain network of beliefs that influence your perception in such a way that you literally see the world as pure land. This is the best possible manifestation of life. This apartment is perfect for me. Where would the apology come from? Don't you know this is pure land that we're in? And I love that was a possibility.
Well, and some of the research that we've done, I'll tell you about a different study that we've done, which also kind of, talks about this, although, again, a little bit tangentially, but we did a study where we sent people through a spiritual retreat program. And so we scanned their brain initially, and then they went through this very intense, immersive retreat program. It was actually based on the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, so it was a more Christian-based study in this particular case. Mm-hmm. And then we scanned them, after about a week's worth of this very intensive program. And what we found was the study that we were doing actually looked, one of the main things that we were looking at was a couple of neurotransmitters, the serotonin and the dopamine system. And what we found was that the brain itself had changed as a result of going through this retreat program. And it changed in a way that made the brain more sensitive to the effects of dopamine. And so what that kind of implies is a little bit along the lines of your story, that because these individuals now kind of saw the world and reacted to the world differently, that dopamine is part of the reward system, so it makes us feel good. So in many ways, it would kind of make us feel good about lots of different things, and maybe even potentiate a very profound experience as well. But again, I think it does have, what it's telling us ultimately is that the brain, can change, and it can change the way we look at things. And the more that we, practice compassion, for example, the more we practice love and kindness for other people through like loving kindness meditation approaches, that it really does change the brain. It changes it can rewire it. It can change its sensitivity to different neurotransmitters, and that can lead people to hopefully more positive ways of thinking about things. And of course, and we can talk about this, but I mean, there are also some times where things don't go so well, and that in and of itself is a really important area for neurotheology, I think, to look at, which is what happens when these experiences, become problematic or create stress or ontologic struggle for people, and how do we help people, through that kind of process, and can we use this, again, going back to the esoteric versus the practical, in today's divisive world, are there ways in which we can try to get people to be a bit more open and understanding and compassionate and empathic towards people who don't believe the way we do? And the data suggests that you can. The question is, how do we go about doing it?
Yeah, nice.
Yes, I ask this slightly provocatively, but intentionally so. The analogy when people have near-death experiences, and they have genuine spiritual moments, and then there's a dismissal, and it goes, well, look, if you look at the brain, XYZ is released, and the fact that you can account for it physically removes the need for the explanation of anything else. So why does Occam's razor not just kill this conversation dead? What are we doing here?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple of things. In fact, I wrote a book called Principles of Neurotheology, as you mentioned, and I actually talk about sort of neurotheology's razor. One of the things that, while I as a scientist, I mean, I love Occam's razor. I agree with it as a general point. But there's an underlying assumption about whether or not you actually need that larger explanation, whether a simple explanation by itself is really sufficient or not to explain something. And so part of what I've always felt is important is to be able to look at all of the different potential perspectives. If you get rid of them too quickly, which is what sometimes people do with Occam's razor, they say, oh, well, it has to, well, who's to say what's simple, who's to say what is the easiest or the simplest solution? And so sometimes people do eliminate possibilities before, they really should be eliminated. And I think another way of answering your question, which, I think about all the time, in this regard, because on some level, if you do brain scans of people in meditation or prayer, are you just sort of reducing it to brain function? And some people take it that way, and it's not a wrong interpretation inherently, but I don't think it's the only one. And one of the other ones, which I think is certainly every bit as reasonable in a lot of ways, is that there's a lot of things in this world that our brains do not readily perceive. We don't perceive atoms, and we don't perceive radio waves and so forth. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but our brain doesn't perceive them the way we are. Now, our brain can perceive them by converting the radio waves through a radio, and then we can hear them. So, who's to say that when you have a practice like meditation, whether you have a near-death experience, whether you have a neurological condition like a seizure disorder, whether you take a psychedelic, who's to say whether those states of the brain that arise from that are pathological and produce those experiences versus are ways of sort of dialing up the brain's sensitivity to be able to see the world in a better way, so to speak, or a more accurate way, or whatever term people want to use. The analogy I always use is I wear glasses, so when I wake up in the morning, it's a blurry world, and I put my glasses on, and the world becomes clear. Now, the world didn't change, and I didn't change, but I see the world differently. So who's to say that by understanding the brain processes that underlie a near-death experience or a psychedelic experience or something like that, that somehow eliminates the realness of those experiences and the accuracy of that those experiences appear to sort of provide to the person who's having them. Maybe when people have these experiences, one of the things they almost all say is, this is reality. This is the real answer to things, and all of the regular stuff in the everyday reality is kind of relegated to a slightly inferior version of reality. And of course, that's where science lives. And so I'm not saying that they're right either, but there's a lot for us to look at before we start just taking Occam's razor to everything that doesn't quite make sense to us. Sometimes we really need to look at these larger questions and not necessarily eliminate the plurality of possibilities before we're ready to do that.
Especially because if you look at the overlay of physical and psychological, if I'm anxious, I feel it in my tummy. We don't dismiss the anticipation. There's a good psychological explanation for why the feeling's in my tummy. And you could say, well, hang on, that's very abstract. The existence of the butterflies that you could pick up with a machine explain conceptually the framework. That would feel limited, and I guess the same is applying here.
Right, and I think at the beginning we talked about, well, people can look at the the neurophysiology behind love or music or art. It doesn't. I mean, we still want to love people, and we want to love our children and our spouses and our friends and our dogs and whatever. So those are extraordinarily important feelings for us as human beings, and I think, to me, a lot of what neurotheology is about is understanding who we are as human beings and realizing that there is a biological part, but there is a psychological part and a social part and a spiritual part. And so all of them kind of come together in us in different ways, and trying to understand that overall interrelationship, I think, ultimately is very helpful on a practical side of things as well as on a very philosophical side.
Andy, can I ask you a quick question there? When you say a spiritual part, is there, I know that's I know it's a tough thing to work through, but what would that be for you? I know that can be taken in lots of ways, but how do you often talk about it if somebody pushes back and says, well, what's the spiritual part all about?
Well, it's a very important thing for us to try to figure out and identify. In Principles of Neurotheology, my first principle is definitions, and so defining spiritual, defining religious is very important. And so, to answer your question for me personally, I do seem to feel, in my view, it has a lot to do with connecting to the larger universe. Getting to some degree, feeling that connection, kind of getting beyond the self in an integrative kind of way. Yeah. Whether that ultimately requires a supernatural side, I don't know. And I'm not saying that we don't have. I'm not saying that we do or don't have it at this point. Part of how I also think about neurotheology as a concept is that for me, it is my sort of combined scientific as well as spiritual journey. And so in trying to, so much of what I do tries to answer to me the fundamental question of what is the true nature of reality and how do we know it? And so I think science weighs in and has a lot to tell us about it, but there are these other parts of consciousness, of subjective awareness, of things that feel that connection and that, whatever we call spiritual for some reason. And so, to me, all of that, I don't know how it all fits together, but I think we need to take a good look at what each of those sides has to say about the world, has to say about each other, and has to say about ourselves. Yeah. And that's why I personally, really get very passionate about neurotheology as something that is looking to kind of bring them together and try to understand how those different sides of ourselves fit together. And part of what I do talk about in the principles is that we have to be open, at least until we're sure, whether, there could be a soul, there could be a spirit, there could be energy of some, like a chi or something that, doesn't have a traditional medically oriented understanding, but again, that doesn't inherently mean that it isn't there. And but it doesn't mean that it is either. So to me, I try to be very objective and try to be very careful and keep working keep working the questions until we hopefully someday will find an answer.
Love it.
Andrew, what's the it's a stupid question, this. What's the big practical edge to your research? Like, if you're listening to the pod, and it's a stupid question for slightly obvious reasons, but if you're listening and you have to sort of pretend now that you're maybe a graduate student or something, and the world is stressful and inflationary and rubbish, what's the practical edge to all of this? Right.
Well, I think it's actually one of the least dumb questions you could ask. Because I mean, there needs to be a practical side of this. It has to be applicable. And I've been actually talking to a bunch of colleagues about applied neurotheology and what that means. And I think the answer to your question goes back to where a lot of the data really have been exploring, which is that practices, meditation practices, and whether it's transcendental meditation, mindfulness, loving kindness, yoga, breath meditation, almost all of these different types of practices can provide people with different kinds of benefits. And it can, at the very least, it seems that it helps to reduce things like stress and anxiety and depression. There's evidence to support that meditation practices can improve cognition and memory and your ability to focus your mind and attention. So, in many ways, it's kind of like, lifting weights for your brain, so to speak. When you lift weights with the muscle, it gets bigger and it gets stronger. And interestingly, the data supports that people who are long-term meditators literally have bigger brains. They have bigger frontal lobes in particular. And they also, our data with functional imaging shows that they are sort of more functionally active, so they become stronger, so to speak, and your frontal lobes can regulate your emotions better, regulate cognition better, and so I think that the short answer to your question is that I think for the large majority of people, finding a path, a pursuit, a practice that works for them. And I think that's an important part of the larger step back point, which is that there isn't a one size fits all. People certainly can explore programs that are more common, but while mindfulness, for example, works for a lot of people, there's plenty of people that it doesn't work for. And I think especially when people come from different religious traditions, making sure that they engage that part of themselves, and whether it's going to a church or a synagogue or a mosque, or whether it's doing prayer, or whether it's following, doing certain rituals or practices, all of that really has been shown to be potentially beneficial to the brain, in the right circumstances with the right kind of person. And so, I always encourage people to sort of, take a look inside what is important to them spiritually, religiously, and then to try to embrace that side of themselves and engage that. And even for people who are atheists, I mean, whether that's taking a walk in the woods, taking a walk on a beach, doing something creative with music or art, all of those have generally been shown to be beneficial for people. So I think the practical side is very relevant and can be very helpful for people to try to find a way of bringing that spiritual side, however they define that in this context, to be an important part of their lives, because it does seem to intersect with our biology and our psychology, and can potentially be beneficial for them.
One of the ways in which we can be practical here is using something called compassionate communication. What is compassionate communication?
So compassionate communication is something that my colleague Mark Waldman and I were working on developing. We published a book called Words Can Change Your Brain, where we talk a lot about this. And what it really is, and this is also part of where neurotheology can kind of help us with the practical side, which is that we can look at scientific data and use that to help people in some part of their life, in this case, communication. So as an example, there's data out there that shows that when people slow their language down, when they speak more carefully and in shorter amounts, that people understand them better. And so if you're now about to have a challenging conversation with in a relationship, a personal relationship, or maybe at work, speaking briefly, speaking slowly, speaking calmly, all of the data shows that that will help you get your point across more effectively. It will allow people to interact more intimately. And so what we ultimately developed were a whole series of ideas like that, speaking slowly and so forth. And of course, there's the other side of listening and trying to use a kind of mindful approach of listening without a whole lot of judgment, and paying attention to what you're thinking and feeling as you're listening, and then responding. So a lot of this all has to do with being more compassionate in the ways we communicate with each other, making sure that our ideas and our thoughts and feelings and concerns are being expressed carefully, and also listening very intently to what other people have to say, with the ultimate goal of creating more intimate conversation and more intimate communication with people. And we've done a variety of research studies looking at that. And like I said, a lot of it derives from the neuroscience of it, so that we can see that if you do these kinds of things, actually, some brain imaging, very interesting brain imaging data shows that our brains actually start to resonate, so to speak, with another person. You kind of activate the same areas of the brain together, and that signifies that you're actually having very good communication with people. So our brains, literally can become kind of resonant with somebody else if you engage in this kind of compassionate communication.
It makes perfect sense. You're not speaking at, you're beginning to speak with, by making a space for speaking with. So now it's not me sending, but us understanding. That's wonderful.
That's exactly right.
Andrew, where is the best place for everybody to find you online?
So the best thing for people to do is to go to my website, which is Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com, and they can look at some of the research studies that we've talked about, and find out more about different books that we've written on the topics of neurotheology and compassionate communication. And I also have an Instagram account now, which is from my daughter. Fortunately, she's getting me onto it. And it's dr.Andrew Newberg. And so people can follow me there as well.
Awesome.
Andrew, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure to chat.
Thank you. It's been great.
This has been the Contemplative Science Podcast. That was Andrew Newberg. And if you enjoyed that half as much as we enjoyed recording it, you were in for a treat. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next week.